started. So everybody, welcome to the first part of a three-part mental health series. This is the second mental health series that the Junior League Summit has presented to the community. We thought that, we actually thought the first mental health series was about 10 minutes ago as Ilyse and I were talking about this, but we realized this was 10 months ago. And this is the week that many of us were put at stay-at-home orders from work, where kids stopped going to school. So we really felt it was time to bring back the series, talk about some of the challenges that we're experiencing within this really unprecedented COVID times. In this first series, or this first presentation, is on coping with burnout. So strategies to manage COVID fatigue and build resilience, which I think resilience is the word of the month. I've had a lot of sessions on resilience, and I'm really excited for Ilyse Dobrow DiMarco to be here on behalf of the Junior League of Summit. Ilyse is a clinical psychologist. She specialized in working moms and burnouts and challenges with working moms. And she has her BA from Yale and her Ph.D. from Rutgers. She's a mother of 2 boys. She has a book coming out this spring, which hopefully she can share some more with us at the end of the presentation. I know she's going to give you her social media information at the end, but Dr. CBT Mom. And Ilyse, on behalf of the Junior League of Summit, thank you again, and we really look forward to your presentation. And then we'll take questions at the end. People can put it in the chat, or they can
Yes,
just
please.
speak right up.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. You know, when we did the first of these series in May and June, Tara and I naively were like, oh, maybe by the last one in June, we'll be able to do it in person. And here we are in March, still on Zoom, but I'm really happy to be here. And I think, you know, times are different than they were even, you know, back in May and June when I did these presentations. So much has changed, you know, from that time to now. So I'm happy to be able to share some tips kind of tailored to what everyone's going through now. Tara covered all this, so, you know, I think she's got all of it. She had all of it down. So I want to start out by saying something, of course, everyone is very aware of, right? Which is that we are somehow 1 year into this. One of the things that I found really interesting with a lot of the people that I work with is that, you know, in the beginning of this, all of us were in crisis mode, right? I mean, and we thought that this was going to be an acute stressor, right? That was going to last a couple of weeks, maybe a month. And so we all kind of hunkered down, right? We sort of like put our heads down and we're like, oh, I just got to like blast through these next couple of weeks. We'll be okay, right? Everyone, again, was really in crisis mode. What of course has happened though, is that this has turned from an acute stressor to a chronic stressor, right? COVID is a chronic issue. It's now been a year. Even with things getting better, we're still going to be dealing with the implications of this for, unfortunately, months to come, right? And what's been interesting to me is that some of the people I work with are still treating it as if it's an acute issue and are still like, I'll just put my head down and try to barrel through. And, you know, that might work as a coping strategy when you're a couple of weeks into something like this, tops. But if you're talking about sustained months of stress like this, you really have to put in place a sustainable coping strategy, right? We have to make a commitment to our mental health. And, you know, I'll talk about this a little bit later, but I'll say this now at the outset that I think women in particular, we all know, are very good at putting other people's needs ahead of our own. This is not a COVID phenomenon. This predated COVID for sure. But I think it's been a particular problem, at least among the patients that I treat during COVID. And so we have women who now over a year have not been prioritizing themselves at all, and have not made, again, a commitment to their own mental health. And you know, you have to set a plan for yourself as you would for kids or other loved ones. You've got to put something in place. And the coping that you do has to be planned coping. It can't be sort of on the fly. It can't be like, oh, this weekend, maybe I'll rest a little, or maybe tomorrow I'll like go out for a walk. No. It's got to be a planned strategy. And so what I'm going to talk about today is a couple of different sort of tips, things that you can put into practice that will make up a really good coping strategy to help you manage the burnout that, you know, we're all experiencing. One is a regular feelings check. One is, I'm going to talk a little about self-care, which I actually spent an entire talk a couple months ago talking about. I want to bring it up again here because it's still incredibly important, you know, as we're burning out hard. I want to talk about reviewing priorities and saying no. Comparison making and judgments, and getting outside. which is a really important overlooked one. The first thing I'm going to recommend that everybody does, and it's a simple thing, but it can really have major implications, is to do a regular feelings check with yourself a couple times a day. And basically what this means is nothing other than kind of stopping yourself and saying, all right, like, how am I doing right now? How am I feeling right now? Like, where am I at? Sometimes it's hard to know what your brain is doing, but you can often get a sense from what your body's doing, right? So you might notice your teeth are clenched, or your shoulders are, really tight, or you're having some like GI issues, right? That's often a signal that you're having some trouble, right? And/or you might notice a lot of rapid fire feelings coming. You might notice a lot of stressful thoughts coming. But basically what you want to do is increase your awareness of how you're feeling. So I usually tell my patients to do this like 3 times a day and coordinate with meals, because it's just easier to remember that way, right? So maybe around breakfast, around lunch, around dinner, you sort of do this check with yourself and you say, all right, how am I doing? Where's my head at? Where's my body at? If you find that you're not okay, try, if you can, in the moment, to engage in some helpful coping strategies. And in a minute, we're going to talk about making a self-care list where you can kind of list out these strategies. But these can be things as simple as like quickly text a friend, go for a brief walk, like take an adult timeout for a moment away from your family. Different things are appropriate for different moments. But the idea is that when you notice you're struggling, you want to put coping into place right away. Why I think this is so important is because one of the main things I've been hearing from a lot of women that I treat is that they get to the end of the day and they melt down, right? And this can be a meltdown from fatigue. This can be a crying meltdown. This can be a screaming meltdown. And I think the reason this is happening is because, again, too many of us are still putting our heads down and trying to barrel through our days and not paying attention to how we're feeling and not paying attention to all the stressors that are swirling around us, to the point where all these stressors are accumulating and all these bad feelings are accumulating. And at the end of the day, we're like, right, in some way, shape, or form. And what I think is that if we can really keep tabs on our feelings, right, and if we can engage coping strategies in the moment, we can stave off these end of day meltdowns, right? And we can stave off these sort of grand tantrums that we all seem to be having, right? It's just really good practice to keep tabs on yourself. Like, think of it, it's sort of like taking your emotional blood pressure, right? So that's the first thing that I recommend and been recommending to basically everybody. I do it myself also, by the way. So the second thing I want to talk about a little bit is self-care. And I'm not going to sort of talk about this too much because, as I said, I did a whole talk on this. I think one of the talks I did back in May. I want to bring it up again, though, because self-care is even more important now than it was when I talked about it in May because of the burnout situation, right? And because, to me, this is a big factor to help you manage your burnout. You may recall, if you saw my talk a couple months ago, that I talked about the sort of public perception of self-care as being about like manicures and pedicures and like getting your hair done. I've always had a problem with that. Number one, because a lot of people don't like that. A lot of people don't like manicures and pedicures and hairdos. But even among people who do, these aren't things you can do every day, right? I mean, unless you're a celebrity, I suppose. But otherwise, like, we can't get manicures and pedicures every day, especially now in COVID times. And self-care needs to be about things that you can do every day and you can make a sustained commitment to, right? So when I talk about self-care, and in a minute, I'm going to ask you guys just to think for a few moments and write a little self-care list for yourself. But when I talk about self-care, I'm talking about something that fits any and all of these criteria. Things that help you feel like yourself, help you recharge, help you feel productive. This is when you like set achievable goals and then feel really good when you achieve them. I think this is a particularly important COVID self-care task because so much is out of our control during these times, right? So to set a goal and to achieve the goal feels really good. And/or things that help you get some alone time, right? So any and all of these things can be self-care. One thing I want to kind of caveat with before I have you guys kind of write a little list for yourself is that we've really needed to get creative with self-care during COVID because, needless to say, with COVID restrictions, many of us have lost the types of self-care activities that we used to really enjoy. So, the classic example, and certainly has been true of some of my patients, is like the person who loves the gym, right? Gyms closed. And then even when they reopened, a lot of people, are still kind of leery about gyms. And what I find is, like, with some of my patients, they'll say, well, like, the gym's out. Yes, I can't do that anymore. And I'll say, yeah, you can't, but what can you do that can sort of approximate the gym, right? And people have found all kinds of stuff, right? Everyone loves the Peloton app right now. There's all kinds of things you can do. So it just requires that you get creative, right? And that you are willing to say, all right, well, my old self-care routines won't work anymore. What can I do now, right? What's feasible now? So I'm going to ask everybody just to take like a few moments, just take your phone, or if you happen to have a pen and paper handy, and just list out a couple of things that'll be on your self-care list. So again, that can fit any or all of these criteria. Help you feel like yourself, recharge, feel productive, and get you some alone time. And consider COVID here, right? So consider what your limitations are based on COVID time. So I'll just give you a moment or two to list that out. Okay, I'll just give you like a moment or two more. And if you need to keep writing as I'm talking, please don't hesitate to do so. Okay. So hopefully now you've got something like a working list, but this is something you should keep adding to as you think about things that, as you go over the course of your day. The next thing I'm going to emphasize, and again, I touched on this when I talked about self-care, but I wanted to bring it back in now because I think it's even more important now, is you need to really work hard to make self-care happen. I'll remind you what I said a couple of slides ago about women notoriously deprioritizing themselves, and that being a huge problem during COVID, huge problem. And I think the only way that I have found in working with patients that women can make sure that they're meeting self-care goals is to schedule them in, to be very deliberate and to schedule them in. What I have told patients to do is the night before, because every day is different now, right? If you are a parent, maybe some days your kids are home from school, some days they're at school, maybe your work is in flux, who knows, right? But every day is a bit different. So what I say is the night before, take a look at your schedule for the next day, right? Set a schedule. And pay attention to, if you work, what your work commitments are, if you've got kids, what your commitments for them are, and so on and so forth. Get everything on there. And then look and see, all right, when tomorrow can I conceivably fit in some self-care, right? And it can be short. You may say, well, I've got 3 to 3:15. You might be lucky and other days have a little more time. Every day might be different, but you really want to look and see, all right, well, what's a feasible self-care time for tomorrow? So when can you get a break? The next question is, what do you do during that break time? And that's when you look at that self-care list, right? To say, all right, well, what's feasible tomorrow from my list, right? So it may be weather dependent. It may depend on how much time you have, where you're going to be, and so on and so forth, right? So take the time to think, well, when can I do this? And what's feasible for this time? And finally, the most important question here is, what do you need to do to make sure that it happens? Now, again, if you saw my talk a couple months ago, you may remember that I emphasize this, and I'm going to emphasize it again because I think it's still so important and not enough people are doing it still. You really need to be deliberate to figure out how to make this happen. So if you work, block out time in your work schedule. Because listen, many of us still working from home. And what that's meant, right, is that, we're working all the time. We're not getting lunch breaks. We're not getting commuting breaks, right? I mean, this is not news to everybody knows this is an issue. So you have to block the time out. You have to say, all right, I'm going to pretend that I'm taking my lunch. This is my lunch break, right? Or this is the time, 3:00 I would go to the cafeteria in the building and, grab some caffeine. I'm going to take that time now. You just have to be deliberate about it and put it in your schedule and make it, and make it stick there. And then that that's your time for self-care. I'll be brief on this because I spent more time on this, a couple months ago, and I don't want to repeat too much, but I do want to just remind you that if you're a parent, you have to be really planful about self-care, right? So that might mean preparing things ahead of time. Like if your kids are always harassing you for snacks, make snack bags for them the night before and say, hey, I'm going on a walk at 3:00. If you need a snack at that time, please go in the fridge. There's a snack bag for you. Screen time, we talked about a lot a couple months ago, but I'll just say that that's obviously a great time for self-care because if kids are on screens, they are occupied, right? So consider timing your self-care with screen time. And if you have a partner, consider reaching out to your partner to say, hey, I wanted to take a walk Saturday morning from 10 to 11. Can you watch the kids, right? And again, if you plan it out, it happens. If you don't plan it out, it doesn't, and then you drop to the bottom of the list. And I'll say that in terms of burnout, and what I'm seeing, I would say that at least among my patients, like the number one cause of burnout is that they're not doing any self-care, right? So they're going about their days dealing with COVID, dealing with what they need to deal with, and not taking any care of themselves. And that, more than anything else, is what I think has been contributing to a lot of burnout among my patients. So that's why I'm really emphasizing this, and will continue to do so. Okay. From self-care, we're going to move on to priority setting and saying no. I've always been a champion of saying no, but I think during COVID, I guess we're not post yet, I'm even more of a champion of saying no. Listen, we're all asked to do so many things, right? As for our kids, if we have kids, for our spouses, for our parents, for our jobs. And the truth is, we don't have the bandwidth that we did a year ago. We don't, right? Again, a year ago, this was new. This was kind of novel. Like, we were like, oh, let's get creative. I don't know about you guys, but for me, I was like, I'm going to set a schedule for my kids every day, and we're going to do music and gym. I mean, that lasted maybe, I don't know, like a week, right? So we were all raring to go at the beginning, right? And saying yes to a lot of things, but now we don't have the bandwidth anymore, right? It's been a year of this that we've been slogging through this, right? And so what that's meant is we have to be really strategic about our priorities and what we need to do and what we don't need to do. And we need to really ask ourselves, and again, this is a good question to ask yourself when you're setting your schedule the night before for the next day, what needs to get done for me, for my family, for my work, whatever, tomorrow? I mentioned this in a previous talk about creating an A and B list, and I think this is really prioritizing is a good way to prioritize, right? To say, all right, what's on my A list? What must I do tomorrow? And then on my B list will be, things that would be cool to get done, but it's okay if I don't do them. One of the talks I gave a couple months ago was about expectations, and we were talking about how to sort of lower your expectations. And I talked about this A and B list in terms of that. But I bring it up with priorities too, because I think the worst thing you can do is set yourself up for disappointment if you have a list of things you really are jonesing to do and then don't get to half of them, right? And the truth is, again, we don't have the bandwidth to get to them anymore now. So it's really important that you put the, ideal, but don't have to be done tomorrow things on that B list so you don't feel so bad when they don't get done. Saying no to requests that you don't have the bandwidth for is really, really important. And like I said, more important now than it was at the beginning of this, because we don't have the resources we once did. So I mean saying no in a number of different contexts. It might mean saying no to family requests. It might mean saying no to requests from friends. It also might mean actually saying no on behalf of your kids. If you have kids, I'll give actually a personal example of this. So my son is in 4th grade. In 3rd grade, they were allowed to sign up for chorus for the following year. My son signed up assuming, he'd be singing in a room with other children. And of course, the year started and chorus was virtual. And that was not what my son signed up for, right? He wanted to be in a room singing with other kids, not staring at a screen, singing by himself. So it got to the point where he would do it and every week complain about it. Every week. And I'd be trying to work and he'd come, oh, mommy, I don't want to do chorus. I hate chorus. And he would complain and complain. So not only was he punished by chorus, but like I was being punished by chorus, right? Because my kid was miserable and he was, unhappy and complaining to me every week. Now, I should say that I'm one of those people who's like an inveterate people pleaser. I always want to please everybody, never let anyone down. And B, I'm one of those, you've got to see a commitment through type of people. Like if you commit to something, you get to the end of it, you don't quit, so on and so forth. However, I decided that despite all of those things, the chorus was making my son so miserable and me so miserable that I bailed. There was an email sent about attendance being poor for chorus, and I kind of took the opportunity and said, hey, I'm not sure we're going to be able to make chorus, this spring. Sorry. And again, this is something I never, ever would have done, and it's against every principle I hold. However, it was a really important no for me to say, because it actually has spared me and my son a lot of agita every week. And again, it wasn't a high priority, right? It wasn't what he signed on for, and it wasn't a high priority, and it was causing stress. So it's again, it can also be saying no on behalf of your kids, and saying no to things that maybe pre-COVID times you might otherwise not have said no to. So I really want you to think about this, because like I said, I actually think saying no is a form of self-care too, because you're protecting yourself, right? And you're protecting your limited resources. Okay. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about comparison making and judgments, which I talk a lot about always, because I think they're a big problem and a big thing, especially in the era of social media. What's been really interesting in like the recent months of COVID, um, has been the explosion of comparison making and judgments around sort of the world reopening and vaccines. And it's been the engine driving a lot of stress and burnout for a lot of my patients. So, it's interesting. Comparison making and judgments has taken a lot of forms among my patients, and also like among, my friends and family. There's an envy piece, right? So some of my patients will feel envious of other people's, COVID lives. They're like, well, I've been shut up in my house this whole time, but like somehow my neighbor is like out, planning the world's greatest road trip. And like, that seems awesome. And I'm stuck here. There's been some vaccine envy that patients have talked to me about, like, oh my gosh, my brother-in-law got the vaccine because he's a nurse, and I'm pissed because I want the vaccine, right? There's been vaccine envy. So there's been a lot of envy. And then on the flip side, there's been a lot of judgment of how other people have handled COVID, right? Oh my God, my neighbor was out with all of these other people, and there were pictures of it on Instagram, and they were all talking and no one had masks, right? There's a lot of judgment of how other people are handling COVID and the restrictions. I'll say too that unfortunately, this has been happening a lot within families. And I've heard about this a lot, actually, both like from people I know personally and also professionally, where there'll be differences of opinion, among family members as far as what's safe and what's not safe. And it's caused rifts in families, which is really sad. And that there's been a lot of that happening. So again, there's judgment and there's comparison making. Social media, as always, is a major culprit in this, right? Because you're seeing other people's lives enacted in a very sort of cultivated way, right? I want to talk about two things that you can do to help yourself manage with some of this. The first thing is what I always say about comparison making and judgments, COVID or no, which is considering the messenger, right? Whose posts are you looking at and comparing yourself to? What I have heard many, many times over from women that I work with, like that they'll say things like, I'll go to the neighbor example. They'll say, oh my God, I am so jealous. My neighbor took this trip, and it was a road trip, and it looked like it was so fun, and there were all these activities and everything was happening, and gosh, I could never do that with COVID. I'd be so anxious, I could never do it. And I'll say, well, what are your thoughts on this neighbor? And like 9 times out of 10, the patient will be like, oh, I can't stand her. Like, oh God, she's, her kids are run wild, and she's this and she's that and whatever. And then I'll always say, well, like, then why are you comparing yourself to her? If she's someone whose opinions you don't value, and if she's someone who doesn't share your particular set of values, why is she a point of comparison for you? And I think this is especially true with the kind of recent COVID comparisons, right? Where people are comparing themselves to other people whose situations are entirely different from theirs, and who often are not people they particularly value, or again, whose opinions they particularly value. So I really urge you, if you notice yourself comparison making, to ask yourself who you're comparing yourself to. By the way, there's also the comparing yourself to people on social media you don't even know, or celebrities, or people you haven't seen since the 7th grade. Like, you can't judge yourself against these people you know nothing about them, right? And that gets me to my bottom line, which has maybe been, one of the things I've said most to my patients in the past couple of months regarding kind of COVID decisions, which is you do you. Like, you've got to make decisions for yourself, for your family, based on your own unique circumstances, because everybody's different, right? Everyone's different. Everyone's families are different. Everyone's values are different, right? Everyone's circumstances. So you can't, whatever your neighbor is doing is not necessarily right for you. And it's not fair for you to judge yourself, whether sort of positively or negatively, against your neighbor if your neighbor is very different, right? And under very different circumstances. So I really want you to look out for this and to be cautious about this, because again, I think one of the things that's really kind of driving burnout is the comparison making, judgment making, right? And the more you can look at judgments in sort of a critical way, in other words, be critical of any judgments you're making or other people are making, the more resilient you're going to be against, against all of this pressure. Okay, so this is my final point, which is get outside, which may seem very obvious, but hear me out. For those of you who are parents, I'm sure like me, you're constantly begging your kids to go outside, right? I mean, that's been like a refrain during COVID. Get outside, get fresh air, even if it's 20 degrees outside, doesn't matter. What I think is interesting is that we are so insistent on our kids getting outside, and many of us are not getting outside at all. Especially those of us who are working from home, exclusively. We're literally waking up, eating, sitting at our desks at home, and sitting at our desks at home until dinner, right? And not getting outside at all. And that's a real problem from a burnout perspective and from a mental health perspective more generally. That is a real problem, right? We have to get ourselves fresh air. We've got to move a little bit. We've got to clear our heads. I mean, you guys know the benefits, obviously, of fresh air and walking. I don't have to tell you. Something I've gotten a lot of pushback on from my patients is they'll be like, well, there's no place to go. Get outside where? Go where? What I always say is, you don't need a destination, right? There's that phrase, I'm going to mangle it a little bit, but like something like, it's not about the destination, it's about the journey, something like that. That's basically what we're talking about here. It doesn't matter where you're going, right? It matters that you're getting air and getting exercise and clearing your head. For patients of mine who insist I have to be aimed at something, I can't just wander aimlessly, I'll be like, okay, let's make a destination for yourself, right? So maybe you consider exploring new outdoor spaces. Maybe there's a new development going up in your neighborhood and you want to go walk around. Like, pick a destination for yourself if you have to, but do it and get outside. And again, this is something you can put on your self-care list and add to your schedule, right? To get yourself outside every day. One thing I want to say too, that I know is I don't want to say it's controversial, but if you're someone who has the ability to work out of your office safely. So again, let me preface this by saying a lot of people can't do that. People are still working at home, or maybe your office is open, but you don't feel super comfortable with how things are being run from a COVID perspective, totally fine. If, however, you have a safe and feasible option for working out of an office at least a day or two a week, I highly encourage you to take advantage of that option. I can speak to that personally. I still don't see patients face to face. I see them over telehealth, but I started seeing them mostly in my office, where I'll just bring my computer there and see them there. I happen to be lucky in that my office I have my own, office space. I have my own waiting room. I don't really see anybody. And it changed things for me tremendously to be able to get out and be in another space. Even if you don't have an office, if there's like a workspace nearby in your neighborhood. And again, it's not feasible for everyone. Maybe their work is closed, maybe their kids are home, right? Homeschooling, and they can't. So I'm aware that this is not an option for many people, but if it is an option for you, I urge you to consider it. Again, from a burnout and resilience perspective, I think it's one of the things that has really helped me and helped a lot of my patients. I think what's been so hard about working from home is that, as we're working, our heads are filled not only with our job and our job responsibilities, but with everything that's going on around us at home, right? So it's like we're thinking about our job, but then we're also hearing our kids, and we know that laundry has to get done, and we're seeing our neighbor driving by, right? And it's very, very hard when we're having all of these inputs, thrown at us at a given time. It's really hard to concentrate on our work or to concentrate on our home, frankly, right? It's very hard to be able to focus on one thing. So if you can physically get yourself outside, it is a real help, right? To be in some sort of office environment, as I said, at 1 or 2 days a week, maybe even. So I'll just throw that out there. As I said, I know it's not an option for everybody, but if it's an option for you, I strongly urge you to consider it. So I'm going to stop there. As Tara said, here is my social media information. And I'm happy to take any and all questions you have. It can be on, the topics that we talked about, or it can be something, unrelated. I'm happy to answer. So let me stop screen sharing, and we can start with questions. I don't know if there's, let me pull up the chat. I don't know if there's questions in the chat.
You can do that through the chat, or we can do it just live. I mean, we're a small enough group. We have about 20, 21 people here, and so if people want to toss out a question or put it in the chat, either way.
Yep, either's good. And please don't hesitate. I can talk more too, but I'd rather hear people's questions.
I think I see somebody's hands up. Go for it.
Hi, it's Nibs. I'm a grandma of of two Summit mothers. And I'd just like to say that I saved my sanity by going out every afternoon for a drive. From the day this COVID started, every single day I go out, and I've had a greater appreciation of nature, watching the seasonal changes, the changes in in developing around here, who I would see, what the traffic was. I just made it an adventure, and that alone helped me through this whole thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, to me, that is self-care at its best, right? And what I think is nice about that too, like when I was talking about self-care, I was talking about how self-care has to be sustained, right? So it has to be something that you make a commitment to and you do regularly. And that's a great example of that, right? Where you're like, well, yeah, now I put it into my routine and I looked forward to it and I could see the seasons change and I could appreciate nature. And I think that is the way to do it, right? You make a plan for yourself and you make it happen and you continue it. Can you address sleep problems? I keep having weird dreams. Yes. So let me start by saying that yes, and I understand that personally. I can't count how many dreams I've now had where I'm in a public place and I realize no one's wearing masks. I assume you've all probably had some version of that. Yes, so I'll talk about sleep, and COVID sleep has been very tricky. So I'll talk about kind of general good sleep hygiene habits to use. It's interesting. So I'm a cognitive behavioral therapist, and in CBT, we don't look at dreams like a Freudian psychoanalyst does, right? Where dreams are seen to be, sort of the gateway to unconscious impulses that we have. In CBT, we really look at dreams as like, okay, well, they're a reflection of what's on our mind during the day, right? And so if we're anxious about something, we're going to maybe dream about it or have an anxiety dream of some form. So needless to say, we're all anxious about COVID all the time, right? So this is going to come into our dreams, and it might not actually be about COVID, right? It might just be weird dreams about other stuff that's just kind of inspired by the stress that you're having. There's a number of interesting things we can do with dreams in CBT, but I think that's like a little far afield. So let me just say that one of the most important things you can do for yourself is to really set a sleep routine that makes sense. So I'm going to give you like some of the highlights of what we talk about in CBTI, which is CBT for insomnia, which, by the way, if anybody has sleep problems, is a wonderful, wonderful treatment. Seek it out before you seek out Ambien, please. It works beautifully, it works quickly, and it's amazing. So I'll give you like a little, some of the tips, from CBTI that my patients have found successful and that I use, by the way. Tip number one for sleeping and trying to get some sleep is to try to keep a regular sleep-wake schedule, which I know sounds punishing because, say, if you have to wake up at 6:30 in the morning on weekdays, you maybe don't want to have to do that on Saturdays and Sundays, but I urge you to do that. That is one of the easiest things to put into place that makes a huge impact on sleep, and in particular in sleep during these kinds of stressful times, right? Go to bed the same time, wake up the same time. I'm telling you, it is a small thing that works absolute wonders. One of the things that's interesting that they say in CBTI is that actually, if you're, say, sleeping in on the weekends by two or three hours later than you would, normally during the week, you're jet lagging yourself, right? Think about that. It's like you're flying to California on Saturday and Sunday and then flying back. And I think that's a really important point because you know how crummy you feel when you're jet lagged, right? Similarly, you're going to feel that way if you're keeping an erratic sleep schedule. So that's number one for good COVID sleep. Number two, I would say, is try, if you can, to keep a consistent sleep routine, like a bedtime routine, which involves, among other things, protecting the hour before bed for something relaxing. I know that for those of us who have kids, when they're finally in bed, all we want to do is fall down Instagram rabbit holes and never come out, right? Like, I'm aware of that. The problem with that, right, is that it's really, really not helpful for getting us into sleep mode. I mentioned comparison making and judgments, right? Unfortunately, Instagram tends to drive those, right? And generally speaking, we want to try to get away from screens if we can, when we're getting close to bedtime. So what I urge people to do The hour before bed, do something relaxing. Try to put the phone away. I'm a big proponent of no phone in the bedroom. By the way, that has helped people a lot, particularly during this COVID time, because I think our phones have become associated with stress for us, right? Because our phones were always alerting us about the latest terrible news about COVID and the election and the awful stuff, right? So our phone, it's almost like it's become a trigger for stress in and of itself. So I would say if you can, the night before, the hour before you go to bed, have a nice sleep routine. Maybe you watch something mindless on TV. Maybe you take an actual physical book and read it. And then when you feel tired, get yourself into bed and try to put that phone away. Try to keep it out of your bedroom if you can. Because like I said, I think it is something that has really disturbed sleep for a lot of people. And I'll say that, like, for a lot of my patients, they've done this and they've come back and said, I can't believe how much better I slept just not having my phone in the room. It's almost as if it relieves a burden, right? And you're like, well, I'll be free of bad news, at least overnight. So those are some kind of quick and dirty strategies. Like I said, there's some cool stuff that you can do with dreams and CBTI, but that's like a little bit beyond the scope of the talk. But if Michelle, if you have more questions about it, I'm happy we can connect after and chat about it more. But that's some good sleep strategies to put in place. By the way, not just during COVID, but always. Really good question, because everyone's struggling with their sleep. I mean, I think it's, we're just living under stress all the time. Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome, Michelle. Other questions I can answer for you. And like I said, doesn't have to necessarily be related to burnout and resilience if you have just sort of other questions about anxiety, stress, anything and everything. Any other takers? You can put it in the chat so you won't feel embarrassed. That's the nice thing about the chat. You don't have to actually speak in front of everybody. Tara, is there anything that you wanted me to cover that I didn't talk about yet in terms of burnout and resilience?
No, I think those covered the key topics. This is helpful for me. It was interesting. I had a talk at work today on resilience, and we didn't talk about the burnout component of it. And we talked only about like sort of the scientific thoughts of resilience. So it's nice to have the practical tips and the ways to really put it into practice.
Oh, good. And I have two more questions. Okay. Do I find some activities better for self-care? I would say two things. I think everyone is different. And so some activities that are self-care for some are not for others. The example that I think of is Zoom calls. So when this first started, and I might have talked about this when I gave the talk a couple of months back, when this first started, everybody was saying, you got to get on Zoom and see your family. You have to see your family on Zoom. Some people like that. Some people hated that because they were on Zoom all day for work, right? So the last thing they wanted was to get back on Zoom, even to talk to people that they loved, right? So that's an example of the issue that self-care for one is not self-care for the other. In terms of activities that are better, I think some of it too depends on what you feel you need in the moment. And that's where, like I said, I like to do that kind of mood check throughout the day, because there may be sometimes when you feel, oh God, like I just feel gross, right? I just feel like a fog is over me. And then the best thing to do might be to take a walk outside, right? There may be times when you're feeling kind of isolated and lonely, and then the best self-care is about reaching out to a friend via text. So again, I think it's partly knowing yourself and partly based on the situation and based on what you need. How might we know our friends are experiencing burnout if they don't tell us? I think the answer is they are. I think I can give you a simple answer to that. What I find is that burnout takes different forms for different people, right? So burnout looks different in different people. So that could be, for one person, it could be that she sort of retreats from talking to friends because she just doesn't have the energy for it anymore. For somebody else, it might be she was someone who exercised regularly and just like can't get herself to do it, right? But I think you can safely assume that we're all experiencing some form of burnout. And I'm in COVID times or no, like I'm always of the opinion that to reach out to someone that you have any sense of, if they're having trouble, and just to say, hey, like, are you okay? is good practice, right? And even if it's a friend who you think is doing okay, like, but you want to check in, you can say, hey, like, how are you? How are you doing? Like, things are hard. What's going on with you? But like I said, I think we can safely assume that burnout's happening to everybody in different ways. And that's actually what's been very striking too, to be a psychologist during this time, is that people have really talked about very different kinds of burnout, depending on who they are, their circumstances, their family, their work. People's burnout has looked very different. But as I said, I think everybody's experiencing it in one way or the other. Retirement in the time of COVID, avoid boredom, how? My mother's been asking me this question for a year, and I'm not sure I've answered it effectively for her. I think it's funny because I actually work with a woman who's retired, who's done a beautiful job during COVID. So I'll kind of use her as an example. And she's an interesting example because she's actually someone who has chronic depression. And needless to say, for people with chronic depression, COVID's been especially tricky, right? Because with depression, one of the things we know that's so important is getting out and being among people and having activities, right? And so with COVID shutting everything down, I mean, that really contributed to a lot of depression and a lot of my patients who are prone to that. So this woman is someone who experiences chronic depression. I mentioned scheduling and routines as being important, and she really made a commitment to scheduling herself every day. And we worked together on this, but she said, you know what, like, I'm going to make stuff up. So the night before, she schedules her day the next day. So she's like, she does some art stuff. So she'll like schedule in her art. She'll schedule in calls with friends. She'll say, at this time, I'm going to call so-and-so. This time I'm going to call so-and-so. This time I'm going to take a walk. At this time, I'm going to cook. And it sounds funny, right? Like, why would you need to set a schedule to like call your friend and cook and take a walk? But if you can give your day a shape like that and you can follow that shape, it can make a huge difference in your mood. And I'll say she's done beautifully. And she's someone who, again, I would have considered particularly vulnerable to COVID mental health issues because of her history of depression, but she was able to use this scheduling to her advantage. So that's what I recommend you do, and make an extensive self-care list. Like, the nice thing about being retired is that, you're more in touch with the things that you can do for self-care because you've got more time for it. Make a list and every night set a schedule for your day. It's made a huge, huge difference, not just for her, but for other patients I work with too. What advice do I have to advocate for ourselves at work in terms of setting limits? So it's a great question. And saying no without being seen as not committed to work as others. Yes, especially the dynamic of women without child versus women with children. I'd also throw out the difference between men with children and women with children, which I have a lot to say about. And I'm sure you guys have read. I mean, there's been a ton of stuff. Most recently, there was a whole feature of, a section of articles in the New York Times parenting section. There was something in New York Magazine recently about like the burden of this falling on specifically women with children, right? So as I said, I would expand that to not only talking, to just basically talking about sort of moms in general versus everybody else. It's really hard. I would say a couple of things. I think what has worked for some of my patients has been, because this has been an issue that's been brought up among a number of my patients, what's worked for some of them has been to sort of identify that person at their job who's the most validating and the most empathic and the most understanding, and reaching out to that person and being like, look, I'm home with my kid. My kid is remote schooling. I'm doing the best I can. Like, what do you think is a good way for me to approach asking for breaks, saying no to this particular, task, whatever. I found that that's helped some of my patients because I think they feel like then they're getting some input from somebody at their job who knows the culture, who knows the climate, and can give them some feedback about what they think would be the best way to navigate it. So that's been something that I think has been helpful. I have to say that some of my patients have gotten to the point, I think, where they've felt that they've had no choice. And they'll go to, their employers and say, look, like, I can't swing this. Is there a way we can work around this? And actually, I've heard about like a number of situations. So some of which, frankly, I think are more sustainable than others. So like, this one woman I'm working with, she actually switched her work hours around so that she works more on the weekends, which, let's face it, sucks, right? But what that meant was that she was able to be around more for her kids during the week, and then her partner was able to take over more during the weekends. So she was kind of able to negotiate that. So I recommend that too, to sort of approach your employers in the spirit of kind of negotiation, to say, like, look, this is not sustainable for me, but I'm committed and I want to work and I'm willing to do this, right? So can we talk about ideas and ways to make this work? So that's been like something else that I think some of my patients have had some success with. It is hard though, right? It's really hard. And I think in particular, the work from home issues have been such a problem if you are the primary parent dealing with school. It's impossible. And I don't have a satisfactory answer to your question, which was a really good question, because I don't think there are satisfactory answers. One of the points that was made in these Times, the New York Times piece, is that I encourage you to seek out. I think the name of the series was something called like the Primal Scream series or something like that. I really encourage you to seek it out, because if nothing else, it's very validating of the experience of working mothers during this time. But one of the points that several of those articles made was like, look, this is like a systemic issue, right? This is an issue with the way that our system is set up, right? With the way that we treat working moms versus working dads. Like, these are systemic problems that need systemic solutions. So, we can try to make changes in our own sort of individual experience of this. But what's so hard, right, is that systemic changes are really what's required to make a real dent. But hopefully I gave you at least some strategies that I think have worked for some of my patients. Yes, Colleen, right. Yep. The whole series about mothers screaming into the void. It's a great series.
And thank you for calling out the systemic portion of it, right? Because it is something that has to change, and it has to be something that people can be vulnerable enough to have a conversation about in the workplace, and trust their manager, their employer, that they would be able to help that. And some will and some won't. And yeah. I think it goes back to that. It goes back to DE&I, right? That we need to be able to create more. We need to create fixes within systemic issues to support women in the workplace, because else women will be dropping like crazy. And I think there was I'm trying to remember where I read it, but just reading about women being the ones that are dropping out of the workplace. And it wasn't the New York Times article. It was a one-off piece. And how sad that is for all the gains that women have made through the years, and then to have to take the biggest hit during the pandemic.
Yeah, it's awful. I mean, so many women being sidelined. It's really awful. And again, I think it's, as a psychologist, it's been hard, right? Because your question, which was such a good one, Marisol, about what to do in these situations, I've gotten a lot from patients, and I wish I had an easy answer and an easy fix. But again, I think it points to larger issues that need to be addressed. And I'd like to think in my ideal fantasy world that one of the good things that will come out of COVID is that we'll make some systemic changes. I'd like to think so. I try to hold on to optimism where I can. Early in COVID. Oh, this is actually a really good idea. Early in COVID, this is from Kay, I shifted to West Coast hours so I could focus on the kids first thing. It worked in my setting. My boss is on the West Coast. That is a great idea, right? And I think, like I was talking before about getting creative in terms of self-care, and I think this is a great example of creativity, right? I love that. Do I have a name of the New York Times series? Yes, I believe it's called the Primal Scream, or the Primal Scream series. It maybe came out 2 weeks ago. Search Primal Scream. The name of the editor, you can search her name too, is Jessica Grows, which is Grose. If you search Jessica Grows and Primal Scream, it'll come up. Was I referencing an article only, or also documentary? No, it was a series of articles. So it was like, one of them was written actually by a perinatal psychiatrist, and that was the article that I'm recalling, where she mentioned. Oh yeah, there we go. Thank you, Kay. And the perinatal. This might be. I'm trying to think if this is that series. It may have been a month ago. The perinatal psychiatrist was the one who wrote the piece where she pointed out, like, I'm going to give you some fixes, but this is a systemic issue, which again, I can completely and totally relate to. These are great questions. Any other questions I can answer? Like I said, either related to burnout or less related to burnout. And we have 2 more of these too. So we'll get a chance to talk. Maybe I'll plug the other 2, which is next time I'm going to talk about values, which is a really interesting kind of jumping off point when we're starting to like try to to think about our current COVID lives and even somewhat of our post-COVID lives, to start to think really seriously about the things we value and what matters to us, and making decisions based on that. So that's what I'm going to talk about next time. And then my last talk is going to be sort of preparing for post-COVID re-entry, which, one of the things that I've been talking about a lot is that, in theory, we're all super happy for life to return to normal. But what I've been hearing about increasingly from patients is that, like, in some ways, they're actually really nervous because COVID has enabled them to avoid a lot of things that maybe make them anxious, or maybe make them uncomfortable, or things they don't like doing, or maybe they're just so out of practice, of putting on clothes, among other things, right? That the idea of going back to that is really daunting. So that's what I'm going to talk about in the last talk. And Tara said I should plug my book. Yes, so I have a book coming out May 9th, which is called Mom Brain. And it is basically, loads and loads of CBT strategies and personal stories and patient stories geared towards, it's geared towards moms with kids ages 0 to 5, but the strategies are sort of evergreen. You can use them really however old your kid is. So there's my plug, Tara. Any other questions I can answer? Oh, here's the link for the DEI Women article. Okay, great. Oh, great. Thank you, Colleen. So there's some good links in the chat too.
Yeah, and we'll add the links to, once we post your video onto the Junior League website page, ladies, we'll add the links so that you can go to the website and access those.
Yeah, great, great. Any other questions before we finish up? And again, I'll hopefully see many of you in 2 weeks talking about values. Post the book link too. Oh, sure.
You can pre-order on Amazon.com.
Yes, I was going to say, just put Mom Brain book into Amazon and it's in there. My mother has probably pre-ordered most of the copies, but if there's a few left, you may be able to snag them.
Ilyse, thank you so much. I mean, it's really a pleasure to have you back. We had so much positive feedback on the first mental health series. And here we are again. We thought we would be seeing each other face to face, but it's so nice to see you on video.
It's nice to see you too, Tara.
And thank you everybody for coming tonight. And we look forward to the next session, which is on the 18th, actually. So it's Thursday, the 18th. We thought we would give you St. Patrick's Day off. So Thursday, the 18th is the next one, 8 o'clock. And we look forward to it.
Yes. Thank you all so much for attending. I was going to say for coming, but we haven't really gone anywhere. And hopefully I'll see all of you in 2 weeks.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.